I think you're on mute.
Workday's starting to sound the same.
I think you're on mute.
Find something that sounds better for your career on LinkedIn. With LinkedIn Job Collections, you can browse curated collections by relevant industries and benefits, like flex PTO or hybrid workplaces, so you can find the right job for you. Get started at linkedin.com/jobs. Finding where you fit. LinkedIn knows how.
Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere, nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Oh, look, we're recording. Hey, everybody. It's ImmaLetYouFinish, episode 218 with your hosts, Courtney and Amy, but Amy filling in today because Courtney will be back, inshallah, next week. We hope. He's fine, just taking a little breather. Before we get to our guest today, my dear old friend, not old biologically, just chronologically, Jeff Mao, just want to remind you that if you're a coffee drinker, are you a coffee drinker, Jeff?
Yes.
Yes, coffee is good.
Not a coffee snob.
What?
Not a coffee snob. Coffee drinker, yes.
Yeah, coffee's good. Well, these days, the thing that you're trying to do in your diet is get protein in. I guess this is to prepare us for the Soylent Green era we're about to enter into. Boy, I'm really doing a good job selling this shit. Anyway, there's a great company called Strong Coffee Company, and they have delicious coffee and lattes, mixes and ground coffee, but it has all these nutrients and it doesn't make you all crazy and jittery. And it has 15 grams of protein, which, like, if you're a vegetarian, that's a really good thing. So if you go on their website, strongcoffee.com, and put in IMA5967, you get 20% off. So there
Excellent.
I think so. All right. So thank you for joining us today. I guess I want to start off, talk a little bit about Rammellzee, who I think it's fair to say that when you start listing the graffiti, you have a really great book out, and I'm not just saying that because you sent it to me. I really love it, called Rammellzee Racing for Thunder. I think it's fair to say that when you're name checking, when the average person is name checking the New York City graffiti giants, his name often gets left out of the mix. Is that fair?
Well, thanks for having me on.
Of course.
And it's great to be here. Thank you for your very kind words about the book. I'm glad you liked it.
And the exhibit. Well, we'll talk about the
exhibit. Right. You know what? I'm not a graffiti authority and would not claim to be any kind of graffiti scholar. But my understanding is, Rammellzee's unique place, as it pertains to graffiti, has probably as much to do with all the various things that he accomplished and did. In addition to, whatever his, prolificness was on the trains or whatever, what have you. I think that, that's a very insular world with it's notorious for its competitive nature. And, so I think the thing with Ram that makes him unique, and is not the number of burners or the documentation of like masterpieces on sides of trains, because that documentation largely does not exist. So it has to do with his ideas, and kind of how he saw the movement and how he brought his own perspective to that, and his commitment to those ideas. And I think those ideas transcend graffiti, hip hop, what have you. I think that's a great entry point. It was my entry point into Rammellzee and all the stuff that he represents. But it's really only the beginning of the story with him. I guess, like, if you were to think of what if you were to sort of try to, like, summarize his importance. He's thought of as one of the only individuals to really attach, like, a concept to the art form. In that, say for instance, you have like wild style, which is like this very ornate way of rendering letter forms, which a number of different artists and writers are famous for. And Ram saw that not just as a ornamental thing, but as an armamental thing. And basically, it ties to this idea that letters needed to protect themselves. An arrow coming out of a wild style letter isn't just an arrow; it represents protective weaponry, and that ties into this idea that Ram had, that letters literally needed to arm themselves in order to protect themselves from misuse in language and disinformation.
I mean, it's
and I think,
philosophy on top. I mean, it's an art form, but there's, there's almost, I mean, he obviously precedes them by many years, but it's almost in the way that sort of Wu-Tang sort of took artifacts and sort of gave them sort of a meaning on top of it. And it's also very Dadaesque in a way, in the way that you're taking, regular items like a number, like a letter, and infusing it with almost like a mythological, philosophical kind of importance,
Right. And the part of that stems from, what Wu-Tang and Ram have in common is some history with, the nation of gods and earths, 5% nation. And, I think that plays into a lot of his philosophies and ideas. And that in combination with just the circumstances under which he grew up, in New York at a period, really, like, in this kind of notorious, infamous period in the 70s in New York, where the city's in crisis. He's going to have a certain perspective and fundamental distrust of institutions and authorities, which is part of what, how graffiti, that movement developed, and how hip hop developed to some degree, right? But
Right.
also, why wouldn't you sort of be questioning, the very sort of basis of language and how it's being utilized when, you're growing up in this period. The city is on the brink of economic collapse. He lives in Far Rockaway, which is an area that's pretty isolated from the rest of New York City.
Right, and it wasn't cute and trendy. Nobody was going to the beach and have beach clubs then.
It's a different type of scene, and but I think that also allowed him to come up with his own ideas, because he wasn't, he says in the book, we employ like a lot of different quotes from him through just old archival interviews and things like that, and lectures that he gave. And one of the things he says is, like, I probably would not have come up with my ideas if I had come up in Brooklyn or uptown or elsewhere. I was on my own, somewhat, and this gave me the perspective of, not following what everybody else was doing and trying to compete on that same level. I had to sort of, like, employ my own ideas and come up with my own style. And that's where he comes up with these different philosophies.
Right.
Gothic futurism and iconoclast panzerism are these like twin philosophies that sort of guide his artistic output, really everything, his music, everything from a pretty early age on. He's writing he writes a treatise that's like explains in extremely dense language. It's almost like comically impenetrable, what these ideas are. And, I think that isolation, and then of course his his move to the city, to downtown New York at this really crucial early 80s period, and just, becoming a part of that fabric as well, that social fabric, that, the nightlife, the art scene, everything like that, and meeting the people he did and whatnot. It's like, yeah, it made him a key figure, but a unique figure, somebody who was kind of on the outskirts of it and yet also in it at the same time.
Well, it's like, and almost like, just for those people listening who are not familiar with Far Rockaway, you have to take a very long, there's only one train that goes out there, and it's a long ass train ride.
And right now, I think there's no train.
Oh, perfect. There you go.
Yeah, this has been, so, I mean, so don't go there right now.
Don't go there right now.
Podcast, yeah.
Stay away from Far Rockaway.
Until they restore the train service.
I guess that's why Third Base got back together, because they don't want to be in Far Rockaway anymore, and they're just going to stay in the city or something like that.
Yeah, it must have
something like that. I was sort of peripherally in that downtown scene. I like to, since no one can verify or not, really kind of exaggerate my importance. I had absolutely no importance in it, but I was hanging, did absolutely nothing. But the thing is, if you tell enough people that you were there, they assume that you did all this stuff. But I was peripherally in the scene. I mean, I was going to clubs and I was downtown. I, probably stumbled being the operative verb, upon him before. I think I told you that the one time I did meet him was at a drug dealer's house. I was not buying the drugs. I just want to go on record of saying that.
Okay.
My friend was buying the drugs for me. But it was a very weird scene there, especially if you're somebody who's kind of in their own little world, in their own little thinking. It was a scene made up of sort of the island of misfit toys and the Lost Boys, in a way, thrown in with all these people, some of whom had a lot of money. The Europeans definitely had money.
Right.
And it was a very integrated scene, but it was both separate and equal at the same time. And I wonder what that was. It was almost like, I would imagine, for someone like him, who's already thinking in a very different way, who's not careerist. I mean, Basquiat was careerist. He wanted to be famous, I wonder what the impact would be like when you throw somebody like that into this kind of scene where he's kind of exalted in a way.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know if you could say he wasn't careerist. I think that, what's the whole thing with, and
again, I don't want to keep referring to him necessarily in the context of graffiti, but the whole thing about graffiti is fame, quote unquote, right?
It's about getting your name up and out there. So I think if you come out of that school, there is ambition. And I think that early, that 80s arts, downtown art scene, you are seeing the money coming in, and, there is ambition there. I think I would imagine for everybody. I just think that with Ram, it was really a commitment to doing things his way that was fascinating for people, probably. Not having been there myself, but I mean, just from talking to different people that I spoke to for the oral history for the book, which is kind of like the narrative spine of the book. It's everybody, kind of was drawn to his charisma, his style, his way of speaking, which was, obviously born out of his own sort of inventive vernacular, but then also this, like you said, there's this moment where it's this collision of different scenes, right? There's the hip hop stuff coming downtown. There's the people with money and the art scene and whatnot. There's the music, and it's all, it's all sort of colliding, and everyone's hanging out. So I don't know. I mean, I think that, it's, his story to me was fascinating because, it just works on a lot of different levels, even though it's specific to that period on some, in my own fascination with that period, it's a hip hop story, right? But it's a New York City story. It's a human story. It's really a story to me fundamentally about reinvention
Right.
And that's kind of what but that's kind of a thing like that's really relatable, as sort of super, and fantastical, as his thing is with, the philosophies, and eventually the way the art, the direction the art goes, and his use of materials and found objects, and then the characters and the costumes and all these things that evolve over time. I think fundamentally there's something, really human about wanting to leave where you're from, whether it's Far Rockaway or someplace else in the world, and come to New York, and come to downtown New York,
Right.
and find your tribe and find people that you can relate to much better than you can, where you grew up. So I was really just drawn to, that aspect of it, just on a very human level, which is ironic because he would always say that, I'm not a human, I'm an equation, as a manifestation
Right.
of his philosophies and ideas. So, but that was, that to me was part of what was really cool about talking to different people about him and his ideas and that whole experience. And
I mean,
I'm super jealous, by the way, because you were, there during
at a
that time
drug
as
dealer's
well.
house with him, allegedly.
Allegedly.
What, you're super jealous that I'm old enough to be alive in the 80s?
Yeah, I was
Fucking
11,
great.
but
you know what's so funny? I
yeah.
actually teach a class. I teach a history of hip hop class, and then I also teach like a music class at St. Francis. And I've decided to make it a punk and hip hop class because those are the two genres that I punk certainly I discovered. Like that was a scene that I was the same age and part of. It was like the first time I'd ever been in a club or around people going, "Oh my God, these people are like my age." Like this is kind of cool. But nobody, I shouldn't say that, I don't think anybody was sitting there going, this person is going to be something, this person is going to be something. I mean, nobody would have been throwing things out if they thought that, right? People were not tossing stuff. I don't think you had any idea because the stakes were just, I mean, we could go on and on. I mean, New York City was just so cheap to live here. And also when you're 21, everything is fun,
Yeah.
But
I mean,
nobody really knew, but it was a place that you could reinvent yourself because the only time you were seeing people was in person. It wasn't like they had social media personas or anywhere else. But if you saw them, and that's how you experienced them,
Yeah, one of the quotes I really love in the book is from Seth Tillett, who was a friend of Ram's, and was like in like maybe the first incarnation of the Lounge Lizards. He was like in, or DNA, one of these groups, and he was, his whole thing was like, the whole conceit of like, some of that music scene was if you played this instrument, you played guitar, then you had to play drums, and then if you played drums, then you had to play, something else that you weren't well versed in, and it was this idea of, creating your own identity and world. And, he said that's why Ram fit in because, maybe it wasn't, I mean, there was an awareness that he was creating his own world, but he created his own real, he really did create his own universe. I mean, he had his own way of speaking, his own sort of like objectives in terms of, or criteria for what, was acceptable to him. And I think like just even socially probably. And I think that's where a lot of the fascination was. It was this embrace of somebody who, it's that tension, an embrace of like, okay, you're not like me, but in some ways you're philosophically like me, and that's why we can relate. It's like, we appreciate you for the differences that you bring, and your own uniqueness. I think Toxic, who was another one of his close friends and is an artist and writer, has a similar sort of quote. It's like he's from the Bronx, he's from like Mitchell houses in the Bronx, and he's like, once I came downtown, where I came from in the Bronx, the cops were all white, firemen were all white, the teachers were all white. When I came downtown, and it's like you go to a punk party, but then Bambaataa spinning or somebody else, and it's like, and then there's reggae and this and that, and it's just like, oh,
like Wonderland. It was like Wonderland.
Yeah, it's not that you're not like me,
and you can't come to this. It's like, you're not like me and you have to come to this. So,
Yeah.
those types of things, I thought, like, they were, those types of conversations and those quotes, and those interviews that I did, it was, I don't know, it just felt very, I wouldn't say that it was necessarily, I've never, not heard people express those ideas before, but it was moving to me, so.
It's funny because, not funny, it's this is something I've been telling my students, because I've been forcing the New York Dolls down there throughout rest, and we'll talk about David Johansen later, and also
Yeah.
Ramones and the doll, and explaining to them that, like, the early punk bands, at least the New York ones, their influences were girl groups and surf groups, and and doo-wop. So if they're not referenced, it's not till later that people start referencing their stuff. So if you're Rammellzee in the early 80s, well, you grew up listening to Top 40 radio. You may have some awareness of, like, the avant-garde art scene. You knew who Warhol was, even if you didn't know who he was. So there's more of a link to that. Your parents may have known people who were Panthers. You may have known some hippies in your life. It was just a different cultural connected thread. And again, not to sound like two old people yelling at clouds, or I'll be the old person yelling. There was a limit. There were only 5 TV stations and 10 radio stations, and we were all listening to the same stuff, basically.
Right.
I mean, the first time I ever danced to a Grandmaster Flash record was at A7, which was an after-hours punk club. And it was just like, oh, okay. It's a very different, connected thread. Talk to me about the exhibit, because that exhibit was really, really great. And what really blew my mind was his large scale work. It was almost like superhero comic book kind of large scale work. Talk about that exhibit a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, really the roots of this book are in that exhibition, which was of the same title, Rammellzee Racing for Thunder, which was a Red Bull Arts exhibition from 2018. So, you and I both come out of journalism. I was, working at the time for Red Bull Music Academy, which was technically not music journalism, but, I think that we were doing the work, I guess you would call it sponsored content, officially, but it's like, we were writing about music and producing, films and radio and all sorts of other things, music related. And it was this, another Red Bull culture marketing initiative, which was Red Bull Arts at the time. And I used to see, Max Wolf and Candace Strongwater, who were the people there, around the building all the time. And then, I caught wind that they were working on this exhibition on Rammellzee. And somehow or another, they were like, listen, you should work on the project. And I was like, amazing. Yeah. That exhibition, ran for like, I want to say maybe like less than 6 months or something. It really wasn't up for that long, but it was really like the first modern, I guess, retrospective. I mean, of his work, and it essentially, the book follows the same kind of like trajectory as what the exhibition was.
Did the exhibit tour?
No, it didn't tour. I mean, it got incredible feedback, and but it was basically broken up the same kind of way, which was like 5 stages or 5 chapters, which is the trajectory that the book follows. It was like his early beginnings in Far Rockaway, like graffiti and pre-graffiti, and then that downtown era, and then sort of his formal entry into the art world and visual arts, and when he starts to like experiment with different, materials, using like, basically like creating these almost like, uh, he's using all these toxic substances basically and pouring like, the epoxy into like a box, and then like just using different found object, but like doing it in a really with a really
Huge scale, if I
yeah
remember correctly. I thought it was so fortuitous that Anne and I went to the exhibit and we saw you there. It was perfect.
yeah
Yeah.
and then to this like, to this 90s period where he's, come up with these different characters who are essentially like, characters he's created that are, this mythology he's created, this story he's created, which is kind of like Star Wars esque. And they're fighting for basically the destiny of language in the universe. And that's this whole sort of like opera he's entitled Alpha's Bet. So he's using found objects, like coming back from the clubs at night, like coming back from, the world or Save the Robots or, area or whatever. And he's like picking stuff up, from the ground, just like garbage that's been put out, and taking it back to his Tribeca artist studio loft, which he called the battle station, and epoxying and gluing all of these things together to like make these costumes and different, manifestations of letter formations, which are called the letter racers, which he glues to skateboards. So this becomes this whole like, as like people who came out of the graffiti movement are getting rejected by the art world, he's sort of becoming more insular as well, and he's devoted to this mythology and the characters and realizing the characters. So he's making costumes.
I'm sorry. What was the? Let's just take like a 5-second break and we'll be back. All right.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
This episode is brought to you by Global X. Since 2008, Global X ETFs has been committed to empowering investors with unexplored, intelligent solutions. Global X specializes in exchange-traded funds that offer exposure to the artificial intelligence ecosystem, including themes like data centers, robotics, semiconductors, and cloud computing. To learn more about Global X's entire suite of ETFs, from covered calls, fixed income, emerging markets, and more, visit globalxetfs.com.
Are you a forward thinker? Then you need an HR and finance platform that thinks like you do. Workday is the AI platform that helps propel your organization, your workforce, and your industry into the future. Workday, moving business forever forward.
And we're back. Okay. So I don't remember what obviously, again, I knew who he was, not knew who he was as a person, knew of him, of course, but what was the response at the time? I don't, were people intrigued by it? Were they like, what the hell is this?
Well, he became a part of that scene. I mean, the art scene really embraced a lot of the writers, came out of the graffiti movement, and they were doing studio art and doing graffiti on canvas and stuff like that. So he was a part of that and showed in a lot of those galleries downtown. And in fact, like, wound up, meeting Jean-Michel Basquiat at like the Mud Club or one of these downtown spots. And then, they sort of became, I guess, in some ways, muses to one another, and collaborated and, did the record Beat Bop that Jean-Michel produced with K-Rob. So, he winds up showing at Anina Nosse's gallery downtown. It's like I guess technically it's not a group show. It's not, but it's like basically Basquiat and him have the same, they're showing at the same time at the same gallery, although technically it's separate shows. So,
so yeah, I think that, he was, there was an acceptance and fascination with him by that scene. And then that's when people from Europe are starting to come downtown, and from overseas are coming downtown and saying, going to Negril or going to whatever, getting caught up in all this sort of collision of different, music and art and hip hop and this and that. And so he starts doing shows in the mid 80s overseas in Amsterdam, in Italy, in Switzerland, elsewhere.
Toxic
So
moved to
yeah,
Italy at that point too, right? Wasn't Toxic, or Toxic moved to Italy much later?
I think it might have been later, but yeah, so he was accepted. I think he was kind of on the cusp of really blowing up, and as a museum show, I think in a very short, very very short time after his first show in New York, like he has a museum show, and I think it's maybe at the Groninger in the Netherlands. So he was really on, about to blow up, but why it didn't quite happen the same way, I think is a number of different reasons. And but a lot of that has to do with this sort of rejection of the artists who came out of that movement, just from the art scene in general. I think, like, people, I think Days Ellis has, like, he talks about it in the book a little bit, about like how the people in this art scene wanted to, like, they wanted to come to the water, but they didn't want to dive in. It's like,
well, yeah, I mean, you ultimately don't want to get your hands too dirty,
Yeah.
And if you have money, if first off, if you have money, you have an escape route right then and there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like they want to kind of observe the culture, but they don't want to get too caught up in it, because there was a lot of negative stuff going on back then in New York in the early 80s too. I mean, it was, a lot of people were very, I'm not saying Ram, but a lot of people, there was a lot of, violence and a lot of drug use. And it was, it was a lot of people caught up in a lot of stuff. So you do want to keep your hands clean, and you want to appreciate, but then that becomes a weird thing, especially when it's white Europeans, of like, are they supporting or are they exploiting somebody,
Right. And I think but it was also, domestic as well. I mean, some of the, gallerists and the curators who really championed the artists, the writers who came out of that movement, were based overseas. And that's actually where, some of the artists, the only places where they could show at a certain point.
Right.
So, and I think the thing with Ram is, like, he was this charismatic character, but also, not necessarily the easiest person to get along with necessarily. Like Esther Ballant, who was in Stranger Than Paradise, she remembers saying, you never knew.
The Squat Theater, who's from
Squat Theater, and played, the violin on Bebop. She's like, you never knew what kind of what Ram you were going to get, when you saw him. And different people are like, well, he could be really, really volatile. And, he had his indulgences. So,
was there some degree of also, I mean, was there some degree of sort of undiagnosed mental illness going on as well in terms of the mood, or was it just like a kind of like, that's the way he is?
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speculate.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, I'm just,
it's not something that I necessarily encountered in the research and interviews that I did. But then, I mean, people back then maybe weren't equipped with the language or the ideas necessarily about, thinking about these things in the same kind of way that we do now. So, so who knows, but
it's also hard to tell if somebody is like an artist or just chemically unbalanced.
Yeah.
Whoa, there's a very fine line. Being creative and being crazy. But yeah, I mean, and it's, so just kind of finish up the sort of the trajectory of his life.
Right. So I was talking about the 90s and, him coming up with these different characters, which he called the garbage gods, and like I said, they were battling over the destiny of language in the universe, this kind of like Star Wars-esque narrative that he came up with. And, he does these, he goes from showing in galleries to like doing a retrospective at a storage space in Tribeca, like doing a few of those, and like it's an invite only sort of thing. And yet there's still like, collectors and visiting people from Japan at these, storage space, exhibitions that he's doing himself. And he puts on his ultimate creation in as far as garbage gods go, which is the Rammellzee, which is this like, costume that weighs hundreds of pounds and he has to climb into, and it's got like a vocoder and like shoots off rockets, and it's got like, all of this different stuff, and
Renegades of Funk on steroids,
Yeah, and so he does these performances. There's some incredible archival video footage of some of that stuff, and he increasingly sort of becomes one of these old school New York characters who lives in this loft in Tribeca by the Holland Tunnel, and then it's like, I guess in some respects a recluse, and not a recluse in that he never appears, but a recluse in that he's just there doing his own thing. I mean, it was around the time that in the late 90s, I actually went to the battle station and interviewed him. And the cool thing, I mean, I didn't really know what I was walking into. I think I might have got his contact info from like Dave Tompkins, who's colleague and friend of mine, who was actually up at the battle station hanging out with Ram quite a bit. And I went there to ask him about Bebop, and of course,
this is for Ego Trip.
This was when we did this. Yeah, it was for Ego Trip. It was related to Ego Trip because it was when we put the Book of Rap lists out. We did a soundtrack album on Raucous. That was compilation.
I have that. I have that.
Yeah.
My wall of CDs I never listened.
And your wall of CDs there, and Bebop was one of the tracks we licensed.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I'll write some liner notes and I'll like interview a bunch of the people whose tracks we're licensing.
Right.
And so I got like somehow I got the appointment to go see Ram, and Brent Rollins and I went and sat in the battle station with Ram and talked to him for like an hour or something like that. And he drank Colt 45 and talked to us about he went on his diatribe about Basquiat, who he had a falling out with eventually, and talked about how that song was nothing to him, and went off about like this iconoclast war that's taking place. And at the time I didn't really fully grasp like the terminology or the things he was saying, but other than this is like a pretty unique experience. And I mean, it was cool, but it was also like he was definitely on.
Right.
And then later, the cool thing was years later, working on the exhibition and doing these interviews and research, I went back and revisited the interview, obviously, just to sort of get some perspective. And I was kind of like, man, I now actually grasped some of the things he was talking about then. I had no idea at the time, just having a better understanding of this philosophy of language and control of it and what it meant. And, I mean, these ideas were super ahead of their time. I mean, in 2017, we were working on the exhibition, obviously the election had just happened the year prior. It was like this truth war and this idea of disinformation, being disseminated, on a large scale was really relevant. And here we are, and we're right back,
in the dustbin of democracy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the thing is even though it took a long ass time for this book to finally be published, these ideas are still extremely relevant. And that's what people seem to gravitate towards. It's like, the feedback on the book, has been really positive, and for both from people who are familiar with his work and not. And just to finish the trajectory thing, I mean, by the time, by the 2000s, he's kicked out of his. I mean, this is kind of like crazy. It's like for this super fantastical sort of mythology that he's created, out of his own mind. It's like the reality is the neighborhood gets gentrified and he has to leave, the apartment. and move in with his girlfriend, well, girlfriend at the time, eventual wife, Carmela, in a small apartment in downtown in Battery Park City. So it's like, um, he can survive all this, but not gentrification.
Right.
Eventually, the art, the commitment to the ideas is such that the toxic materials that he's working with to create the art is the thing that
Yeah.
causes him to deteriorate, health wise, and that's eventually what happens. So he
Yeah.
passed away in 2010. Yeah, and that was because he was constantly living in these toxic fumes, and then people have stories of like, neighbors calling at the battle station in the building on Late Street, like calling the fire department because of
Oh, he was on
he
Late
couldn't breathe.
He was
He was
on
on
Late.
Late Street. He was on Late Street right by the Holland Tunnel.
Oh, okay.
So,
That was like
uh,
no man's land down there.
no, it's so. The
I was
building's
at,
still there. Yeah, you
no,
still
it
walk
was like
down there and
no
see
man.
it. But
I used to work at a bar on Church and White. No, yes, Church, yes, Church and White. And we in 82 to 84, and we would get off work and there was nothing. I mean, there was nothing. And it was absolutely, the Mug Club was down the street, but it wasn't
right,
open. And then there was like a diner, there was the Square Diner.
right.
There was some other
Wait,
diner.
Square Diner's still there though, isn't it?
Is the Square Diner still there?
I
And
think
then
so.
there was a Mexican restaurant that opened up on Beach Street that Will Sokoloff opened up from
Will
Sleeping.
Sokolov.
Yeah, it was Will Sokoloff. I knew Will Sokoloff as a restaurant owner before I realized he was a record label.
Yeah,
How I
yeah.
knew him. It's like, oh, Will Sokoloff, who runs the Beach Street, restaurant, and I was like, oh, he puts out records as well of that. That's so funny.
You
But
know what's funny? You know what's funny about that time? And I wasn't in New York at the time, but like when you go back and watch After Hours or something,
yeah,
and it really I mean, this is obviously like cinematic portrayal of desolation of downtown and exactly what you're saying, right? This like totally off the beaten path part of New York City. It's still like I showed that movie to my kids and they're like, yeah, this movie's great. And you think it wouldn't translate because it's so foreign, in today's era of just like constantly being plugged in and nothing in New York being developed, not being,
nothing.
totally developed. But
Yeah.
it captures that in a kind of incredibly entertaining and funny way. So
Yeah, it was pretty, nobody, I try to explain to my students, I mean, you can go on and on, old people yelling at clouds, that I knew people who grew up in Soho and they didn't have running water. I mean, they lived in coal flats. I'm like, what? And I'm like, yes, it was scary. Dumbo was scary. The first time I went to Dumbo, I was like, how am I going to get out of here without dying? And that's in like 1983. I'm like, I'm going to die because I didn't even want to walk home. And I was with like my then burly boyfriend, and I was like, we were afraid to just walk home. And now it's like, skip to Malou, my darling, everywhere.
right. Yeah, now it's the
Well, hopefully Eric
like the
Adams,
most
will drag us back into the gutter again so we can experience random
He's
crime
trying.
at like extremely high prices. This is going to be like the greatest segue known to mankind. So
Okay, go for it.
yeah, go for it. Speaking of Black Genius, Sly Stone documentary. Now that you're off embargo,
Yeah.
how did you get involved with that documentary?
So I was a story producer on the Sly documentary. I got involved through Joseph Patel, who was the producer on the film and worked with Amir Questlove Thompson closely. Well, was friends with him for years, and then they worked together on a film called Summer of Soul, which you may have heard of.
Yes.
So Summer of Soul,
the movie that preceded The Slap at the Academy Awards.
Yes, yeah, it's in some circles, I guess it's known as that. But so Summer of Soul was an incredible film, incredible music documentary, and I had heard they were doing the Sly film. And so I just hit up Joseph and was like, listen, if you need help with this at any level, let me know. And we got to talking about some other projects, some other ideas. And eventually, and we had known each other for years, just through music journalism days, for decades. And eventually, he was just like, look, I think I'm down to bring you in to do some pre-production stuff to the sort of hammer out story. Because we're, you seem to really have a handle on, Sly's history and his music. And I was like, yeah, I'm like a lifelong fan. I've been a huge fan. And he said to me, well, look, this is the premise of the film. And he explained this burden of black genius idea that Amir, had, and was just really the thing that he wanted to inject into the story, not just about Sly, but have it be a broader subject matter. And I was all in. I was like, man, I'm totally down with this. And so, I mean, my own perspective was, that that there was always a blind spot, in historical tellings of Sly's story. Either it was super boomer centric and was always kind of the same thing in terms of like, okay, here's Sly, here's Woodstock, and then Woodstock was like the death of our era and this and that. Or, it was more of like a later period searching for Sly thing where it's all these white dudes, deciding like, we're going to find this guy. But then it inevitably becomes their story because he's such a recluse.
Right.
Or it's people who had no sort of context for his music in terms of the hip hop context and its importance to that as well. So I felt like with these guys, I mean, they already had a great, team. Summer Soul won the Oscar for best documentary that year. And so I just was like, well, I feel really compatible with this material and in this perspective. So I came in to work on pre-production for 8 weeks and just wound up becoming, enough of the, involved to the point where Joseph was like, look, I'm going to advocate for you to just actually work through the duration of the project. And that's how I got involved. So yeah. It was an incredible experience and a great learning experience and just a blessing to be a part of. And I felt that, it was a greater purpose. It wasn't just, telling the story of this one musician. It had an ambition to do something more than that. In the same way that Summer of Soul, these guys were able to tell a story about history and who gets to tell history and how it's remembered. So, the fact that it was beyond just the music story, but there was obviously, the music story was going to be told by people who really gave a shit about the music and, understood it.
Say that I thought that Vernon and Jam and Lewis in terms of comment, Vernon's commentary, I've known Vernon for a gazillion years. I'm sure you have. I've never actually seen Vernon I've seen him interview, but I've never seen him in a lot of documentaries unless it's specifically about Black rock, right? So right. I thought he was a really great choice for that because I don't know why you wouldn't think of him in terms of Sly Stone, but it made perfect sense. And then the Jam and Lewis stuff, when they were breaking down Stand, I was like, yes, this song, because that was like my favorite. I loved Stand. I love all his stuff and old enough to remember when he was on, but I always loved Stand. That was always because you could really dance to it. You could kind of like move to it and then just do a full out.
Yeah, it's cathartic, outro, this last part where it turns into this whole different section, this whole different part of the song. And it's such an incredible release. But I mean, I think not for nothing. I think like the decisions that were made in terms of who was going to be interviewed, I I feel really good about those choices. I think we all felt really good
Yeah.
about those choices. And it was a you know, it was a vetting process. We didn't want to, no disrespect to anybody, but you know, you see a lot of the same people interviewed.
Yeah.
And I think our goal was to check several boxes for every person. And also to we didn't make this an explicit connection necessarily, but um, every one of those, sort of music pundits that's interviewed for the film brings lived experience that is relevant to the story, to the bigger story, as well as their expertise, whether it's Vernon, who, like you said, is fantastic, or, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, or, Nile Rodgers. They bring something both anecdotal and, scholarly on the music level, I think. And, with Vernon, it's like there's a scene where he breaks down this interview, with Dick Cavett that Sly does in 1970, shortly after Woodstock, I think.
Yeah.
And, it's about the white gaze, essentially.
Yeah, no,
and,
it is.
And it's because, and the reason why it's so insightful and why he's able to analyze that scene is because he's been in that seat. He's lived that. So he understands fundamentally what that experience is like. And I think that, some of these, these guys are all.
As has Nile Rodgers. Nile Rodgers also been the guy where people are like, really? You play that kind of music?
Yeah, but it's like everybody brought something else, I think, and that was important, I think, in terms of how that decision making, those decisions were made about who to interview. It was like, well, because there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff that we couldn't use just for time, and but there were other things that to me informed their interviews, which was really insightful. So, and also I think getting musicians who had some firsthand recollection with the music, and then also, I mean, you don't know from the film that Nile Rodgers, in the universe of the film, it's not included that he produced the Grammy, ceremony that Sly tries to make a comeback in and do appearance in the 2000s. But it's like, it wasn't necessary, ultimately, there is a connection. There were other connections that these guys had directly with Sly too, in different scenarios. I mean, Vernon, this didn't go in the film either, but I mean, Vernon was at a gig, in the 80s in New York with Sly is, playing with the pickup band and stuff like that. And, so all of these different things, even if they're not explicitly in the film, I think, everybody brought something.
Right.
So there's some reading between the lines, I think, that you can take out of that, especially with, certainly in the D'Angelo interview, I think it's like, I don't know, recall him doing an interview like that.
Yeah.
So it was a pretty special experience, I got to say.
Have you ever heard, and then we'll wrap it. I just want to talk to you about, but have you ever heard Kathy McDonald, the Insane Asylum record? I
have not.
I'm going to send you the track. He produced the record. She was a white San Francisco had a lot of sort of white blues singers. It had a big blues, Boz Scaggs, all those had that kind of community. And it's a cover of Willie Dixon's Insane Asylum. She had like a psychotically tragic life, one of these just exploded, never kind of made it out of the Bay Area, but he sings on the record. He produced the record. There's like a phenomenal list of session musicians on it. And so when I saw that woman in the movie but she had been like a girlfriend of his. I don't think Kathy McDonald was ever a girlfriend. I think that, but that kind of like.
Well, you never know.
Well, that's true. Okay. All right.
I don't know.
Well, she's dead. She's dead and he's dead. But anyway, I'll send it to you because it's one of those, I told Michael Gonzalez about it. And, Michael, he's like, you should write about her. I'm like, no, I don't want to write about anybody.
Well, you mentioned Ruth Copeland, who was in the film. And that was actually like a great source of pride for me personally that we were able to find Ruth, because Ruth
Yeah.
was one of these real cult figures, who was originally from the north of England and then like
Right.
moved to Detroit in the mid '60s and was down with Parliament Funkadelic in the very, very early days, and wrote songs for Osmium and stuff like that. And she was kind of this, became a recluse.
Yeah.
Just got out of the music industry. So, and then, the fact that she had a personal relationship with Sly and was
Yeah.
involved with him. I mean, like I said, everybody was like, we were trying to like check different boxes with every interview to hopefully get a range of different perspectives on different subject matter. So,
Well, you succeeded.
thanks. I'm
And
glad
the
you
footage is
glad you
great. It
enjoyed
just
it.
reminds me, it's so funny, like old woman yelling at clouds. There is something nice about, I guess, being the age I am, in that this was just the stuff I grew up listening to on the radio. I don't think, well, I mean, I'm 10 years old, so it's not like I'm deconstructing and going, oh, look, it's a man. Though it always blew my mind.
Mm-hmm.
A woman was playing the trump. I never associate that women could play horns. I thought that was a boy only boys played horns. But it never really occurred to me like, oh, there's a black guy and a white guy. It just, I mean, now that would be like deconstructed and written about and examined, but it's
Yeah.
sort of like they were there,
Yeah. I
and
mean,
it was top 40. I mean, this was, as you know, top 40 radio. I mean, it just was,
I mean, we spent, we spent, countless hours, just like living in the research and his, just, I don't know. It was dissecting this internally, just different conversations. Um, you know, and I mean, by the same token, it's like, but it was like a pretty monumental thing,
Yeah.
it wasn't, I mean, it was may not have been analyzed to the same degree that it would be now in the same kind of way, but I mean, it's a very simple thing. I mean, it was democratized in a way, right? It's like, okay, this is what my vision is. This is what my interest is. So I'm just going to,
Do it.
do it. I have the know-how to do this, and I have the vision, and this is how I'm going to approach it. So I think there's an, intentionality with that. That is, and somebody had to do that. Somebody had to be that person to do it, and he was perfectly positioned based on his own experiences and where he was living in the Bay Area, which, like you said, is this different type of vibe. And I don't know. I mean, I can't. It was a really a tremendous experience to work on this project. I always like equate, anything that I've worked on, there's a certain moment or certain time or certain feeling of being really, really immersed in the material. And that's like the best to me. It's like
Cool.
it's the most fun to be like kind of in sort of like hunkered down and just fluent, with like a small team of people and just be fluent in the material. And I feel that, it was certainly with this project, with the RAM project, with stuff I used to do with the guys in Ego Trip. I mean, it was just like you have your own way of communicating. It's like, your own references, your own inside jokes, and it's really based on you're all sort of working
I
together
still
on this
refer
thing.
to people as monkey asses because of you guys. I would want to thank you. I call everybody your monkey ass, and they look at me. I'm like, hey, I didn't come up with it. I will say this, and then I'll just like quickly wrap that the intro to Music Lover to me remains still one of the greatest like sort of vamps and riffs ever.
Yeah.
It's just so, and my parents were not big pop culture people, and my father had like negative zero use for pretty much anything I listened to or my sister listened to. But my dad, to his credit, took me to go see Woodstock. I wanted to see Woodstock. It was a rated M movie. I so
For mature?
for mature audiences.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and he took me to the movie theater in Port Washington, and was it like a 3 fucking hour movie or something ridiculous? He probably sat there reading the newspaper the entire time, but he took me, or maybe he dropped me off and then picked me up. His
Right.
thing was always like, if I say she can go, she's my daughter, let her in, leave me alone. I'll pick you up, when time's the movie over? But I just always remember seeing that movie and it just like blowing my mind, like how great it was. I want to just talk to you just a little bit. I mean, we lost Angie Stone this week, who was just talk about an underrated, somebody who I don't think still doesn't get her 100% of her due. Did you ever interview her or meet her or have any dealings with her?
I did not, no.
Yeah, she my memory of I met her like once or twice. She was at the Great Day in Hip Hop thing. Were you there? Were you?
Okay.
Yeah.
I was not there, no.
She
Because,
came with D'Angelo, but she was the one that they were photographing, not him.
Oh, he wasn't out at that point?
No, because
Okay.
because of sequence. She was in it because of sequence. So it was sort of like she's showing up with D'Angelo and all the girls on 120. Oh, D'Angelo! And it's like, yeah, great. I'm the one that they're here to like, this was still thin D'Angelo, so he was over there. But what I do remember about her is that when Leslie passed, at the funeral, Leslie had been working with Angie, and Angie was going to sing at the funeral, and she had a sore throat, so she sent another singer to fill in for her. And I just always will remember that. So rest in peace to Angie. And then David Johansen. I don't know if the Dolls meant anything to you, but they meant everything to me. So
I have the records.
I have the records. They changed my life, Jeff. They changed my life.
What is your strongest memory of them or their music?
Well, I never saw them in their heyday because I was 12. I do remember saying to my mom and dad, I want to go see the New York Dolls. And they're like, what do yeah, sure. You're going to come in from the subways and go to the Mercer. But I saw them when they got back together after Johnny Thunders died. And I saw David Johansen either as Buster Poindexter or as the Harry Smith stuff. But I do remember when I was a kid, when I was like, all right, so the Dolls came out in 72. I remember seeing them on TV on Midnight Special. I definitely remember seeing that. Dolls came out in 72. I'm like 13. Maybe I'm 12 or 13. And I'm in, you do your back to school clothing shopping. And it was always like, ugh. And my mother's like, all right, if you behave yourself, you can buy a record, because there was always record stores in the department stores. And I pointed up on the wall and I saw the New York Dolls cover and I want that record. And she's like, no.
She said no because she was familiar with them?
No, because they were like, what that first album cover looks like?
Yeah, you flip over and they're
dressed like they're in women's.
They're dolled up. So
yeah, they're dolled up. Well, no, they're just a phenomenon. I've been going back and listening to the stuff and just how messy and great. But he was just a fantastic showman and a great singer. And next to Wu-Tang, the best thing that's ever come out of Staten Island.
Oh, David Johansen was from Staten Island.
They're all from the outer boroughs, all of them.
Yeah.
They're all that was one of the things that was great about them. They were not Manhattanites. They were all like, he's from Staten Island and Johnny was from Queens and Sylvain was from Brooklyn. And I don't know where the other two were from. Queens, I think also Queens. They were like outer borough rejects. Anyway, let me name the book again. It is called Rammellzee, Racing for the Thunder or Racing for Thunder?
For Thunder.
For Thunder. And it's on Rizzoli Books, right?
Rizzoli and Cannons. And shout out to Max Wolf, who is co-author, co-editor. He was head of Red Bull Arts, and so was like the head curator of the original exhibition. So shout out to Max, who shepherded this book through a lot of changes over the years, and I'm just thankful that Isabella Rizzoli and everybody who worked on it, Candace,
it's nice,
Aaron, everybody, all the collective efforts. Glad it's out in the world.
And it's very heavy too.
It's heavy as hell, yeah. It's definitely, it's heavy as hell. Just
not heavy intellectual. It's heavy intellectually too, but just physically.
It's a
I
pain in the
always
ass
do
to
a thing
carry.
like
Yeah.
I always do a thing like this is audio. There's no video, but I always do a thing when we have writers where I bring the book and I hold it up and I was like, yeah, I can't lift this thing.
You can't lift it up. Here, I have a copy of it.
All right, show it up.
Ah,
It's a oh look at that. Oh look, it just happens to be sitting right there. Anyway,
Yeah.
Jeff, thank you so much. I haven't seen you in a million years, and I hope you
no,
guys are all good. The fam's good. We
we're
go way
good. We're
back.
good.
Yeah, everybody's hanging
Yep.
out. Everybody's
Yeah,
like,
everybody's hanging out.
is it almost
Yeah.
high school time?
It is high school time.
No, oh, where is
But,
he going to high
but
school?
I don't know. Well, in the city, share private information.
Oh, right. I totally forgot.
But
All right, we'll cut that part out.
but
We'll cut that
yeah, high school and middle school right now. So
Cool.
but soon high school for everybody.
Yay.
See how that goes. Yeah.
Yay.
But thank you again for having me on, and I'm just glad I'm just glad these you work for years on something and then it's out in the world and it's like you hope it just doesn't just like come and go as a blip. So I'm really thankful that um people have taken to the projects,
Yeah.
both the book and um and the film, and just happy to have been a part of both. So
All right. So this is I'm gonna let you finish. It's episode 218. We are available. If you're listening to us, you know where we're available because you're listening to us. But we are part of the Pantheon Podcast Network. Please support us. Please go out and buy the book. If you haven't seen the Sly documentary, it's on Hulu. So it's just really great. And I'm not just saying this because you're my friend. I wouldn't have had you on if I didn't like either one of the projects, because then I'd have to. It's like how we would
You'd
never
have to pretend. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like how we'd never review
That
our friends'
sucks.
records if we didn't like them. Like, hey, review my record. I'm like, oh, I really can't. It's a conflict of interest. I'm only like gonna review the shit that I already like. And I will say, on our parting, as a journalist, one of the greatest honors in my life was being in the acknowledgments in the Ego Trip books. And it's always Amy Linden. It's always Alan Light, Amy Linden. It's always like we're always right below each other all the time, but it's always really great. And it's always so please, I hope, Courtney, we miss you. He'll be back next week, and see ya.
all right, see ya.
Bye.